I need to explain where money comes from, because there's a lot of misinformation about that. Most people think, well, the money supply comes from the government or from the central bank.
From the Fed.
Which is a reasonable argument, because most people would argue, well, that's what it's supposed to be, isn't it? I mean,
it says Federal Reserve note right at the top.
Yes. Of course, these Federal Reserve notes, the paper money, is only around 3% of the money supply, which begs the question, where do the 97% of the money supply come from, which is, of course, digital money, which we've been using for many decades. They're now trying to tell us, and I'm sure we'll come to that, that, the central banks need to issue central bank digital currency. It's a new age. Well, hang on. We've been using digital money, bank digital money, for decades.
Right. BDCs.
Exactly.
Okay.
BDCs.
I'd never heard that before.
Well, because they want to sell these CBDCs as something new. But the new thing is the centralization.
Correct.
And that's the thing that we don't want and we don't need.
So let's just start with the BCDs.
Exactly.
Right? The bank digital currency. This is where the experts have always told me, Glenn, we're not going to have Weimar situations because we digitize the money. We're not physically printing it. But I don't care because it's used in the same way, right?
You're absolutely right. It doesn't matter whether it's paper money or digital money. You could even argue the more it's become digital money, the easier it is to create inflation.
Correct.
Because transactions, can be faster, the volume can be massive, and you can do more of the sort of speculative transactions that create many of the problems. So let's step back. Where does the money supply come from? The 97% of the money is created not by the government, which doesn't create any money. In fact, being here in Dallas, in 1963, John F. Kennedy issued United States notes. That was government money. And that wasn't an idea that was very popular with some circles. And it was the last year of his life. Since then, we have not had governments issuing state money. So the money.
I didn't know that about.
Oh yes, I've got one of those notes actually.
Really? With you? No.
It's in my book.
Never heard of them.
That's right. Well, of course, by doing that, in many ways, John F. Kennedy was doing what most people would have thought is normal. The government is issuing money.
Correct.
But of course, since the creation of the Federal Reserve System in 1913, that's become the essentially monopoly. To lend to the government was meant to be done via the banking system headed by the Federal Reserve, the central bank. Because if the government issues United States notes, then it can create money and doesn't have to pay interest. You see? But of course, the moment you say, okay, well, the banking system, the Federal Reserve will create money and will lend it to the government at interest. Who's gaining? Of course, it's the financial system and the smaller number of people benefiting from that, and you get a transfer from the many to the few, which is why when they create central banks, they at the same time always introduce new taxes. Why? How is this interest from the government going to be paid? Well, from the taxpayer. So when the Fed was created, that's at the same time when they introduced for the first time the federal income tax. And of course, if you go back...
So they actually go hand in hand.
They do. And we know this from history. It's always the same. So when one of the oldest central banks was created, the Bank of England, as a 100% privately owned bank, essentially a central bank, although it was privately owned. They did this through a law which was about imposing taxes. It mentioned, and we'll create this entity. They sort of kept that hidden in the law. But the first part, the front of the law, was mostly about all these new taxes which will be introduced in order to then actually raise the money to pay the interest that the state would then pay to the Bank of England, you see.
Wow.
So, well, we can come back to this. So the governments don't create money anymore. They've outsourced this. And funnily enough, though, the central banks only create a tiny part of the money supply, usually around 3-4%. and the majority of the money supply is actually created by banks.